In 1937, a plant that could grow on abandoned dirt, require zero fertilizer, and produce more fuel per acre than any oil crop in North America was quietly removed from every USDA research program, every agricultural bulletin, and every land-grant university curriculum in the country. It did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because one man's oil company stood to lose billions if ordinary American farmers figured out they could grow their own gasoline. The Amish never forgot it. And today, what those families quietly kept growing in their fields is technically regulated by the same federal agency that oversees moonshine. Hi, my name is Robert, and this is Forgotten American Nature. This channel exists because somebody has to say the thing out loud. The knowledge your great-grandparents carried, the stuff they grew, built, fermented, rendered, and cooked without asking anyone's permission, did not become obsolete. It became inconvenient. Inconvenient for the companies that needed you dependent. Inconvenient for the agencies those companies quietly funded. Inconvenient for an entire economic system built on the assumption that you cannot produce anything yourself and should not try. What the plant actually is. The plant is called Jerusalem artichoke. And before you click away thinking this is a gardening video, let me tell you what it actually is, because the name is almost perfectly designed to make you underestimate it. It is not from Jerusalem. It has nothing to do with artichokes. The name is almost certainly a corruption of the Italian word girasole, meaning sunflower, which is exactly what it looks like. It is a tall, aggressive, almost unkillable perennial sunflower that produces dense clusters of knobby tubers underground. Helianthus tuberosus, native to North America, grown by indigenous peoples across the continent for centuries before European contact. Now here is where it gets interesting. Those tubers are packed with a carbohydrate called inulin, not insulin, inulin. It is a long-chain fructose polymer that ferments rapidly and efficiently into ethanol, fuel-grade alcohol. The same thing that goes into your gas tank when you buy corn ethanol at the pump today, except Jerusalem artichoke produces it at a yield that makes corn look embarrassing. We are talking about yields of up to 700 gallons of ethanol per acre on marginal, unfertilized, unirrigated land. Corn ethanol, the crop that now dominates the American biofuel industry, produces roughly 400 gallons per acre on prime fertilized farmland with significant petroleum-based inputs. Let that sit for a moment. The crop that Big Oil buried in 1937 outproduces the crop that replaced it by nearly double, on worse land, with no fertilizer, no irrigation, and almost no maintenance. Because Jerusalem artichoke does not just grow, it spreads. Plant it once and it returns every single year, more aggressive, more productive, harder to kill. Farmers who have grown it call it the most unstoppable plant in North America. Some of them say that not entirely as a compliment. It was called the gasoline plant in farming journals of the 1920s and early 1930s. Not as a nickname, as a functional description, because that is what it was. That is what it grew. And then, in 1937, it simply ceased to exist in official American agriculture. How the Amish used it to understand why the Amish held onto this plant when everyone else let it go, you have to understand something fundamental about Amish and Mennonite agricultural culture that most people get backwards. The Amish are not anti-technology. They are anti-dependency. There is a difference, and it is an important one. An Amish bishop does not reject a tractor because it is a machine. He rejects it because it creates a relationship with a fuel supplier, a parts manufacturer, and a credit line. It creates a chain of dependency that the community cannot control. Remove one link, and the farm stops. That is the objection. Not to the technology itself, but to what accepting that technology costs you in sovereignty. Jerusalem artichoke fit perfectly into that framework. A plant that grows itself, returns every year, requires no purchased inputs, and produces fermentable sugars that can be run through a still to produce fuel alcohol, is, by definition, an independence machine. The Amish communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Holmes County, Ohio, did not call it by its Latin name. They called it by local names: sunchokes, topinambar, the old German term carried over from European farming traditions. They grew it on field margins, along fence lines, in the rough corners of properties where nothing else was being grown anyway. The fermentation process was not complicated for communities that already understood fermentation at a deep level. Cheese, vinegar, sauerkraut, sourdough. These are fermentation cultures in the most literal sense of the phrase. Adding tuber mash to a fermentation crock was not a leap. It was an extension of existing knowledge. The resulting crude alcohol, in some communities run through copper pot stills that had been in barns for 3 and 4 generations, was used to fuel stationary engines, grain grinders, sawmill equipment. In some documented cases, early farm vehicles modified to run on alcohol fuel rather than gasoline. This was not fringe experimentation. This was practical energy production carried out quietly, consistently, and with zero dependence on a fuel supplier. Now here is the part that nobody mentions in the history books. The Amish did not keep growing this plant out of defiance. They kept growing it because they never got the memo that they were supposed to stop. The USDA bulletin that quietly killed Jerusalem artichoke as a fuel crop in 1937 was directed at land-grant universities and commercial agricultural publishers. It never reached, and was probably never intended to reach, communities that were already operating outside the commercial agricultural system. The Amish kept growing it because it worked. They are still growing it today, and they never needed anyone's permission to do either. The science that made it a threat. Let me give you the actual numbers, because the numbers are what make this story make sense. In 1926, the Ford Motor Company, which had been running test vehicles on ethanol blends since the early 1900s, commissioned a series of agricultural studies on domestic ethanol feedstocks. Henry Ford genuinely believed and said publicly on multiple occasions that American farmers should be producing American fuel. He called petroleum dependence a national vulnerability. He was not wrong. Those studies looked at corn, sorghum, sugar beets, and Jerusalem artichoke side by side on comparable land. Jerusalem artichoke won in every category that mattered for fuel production. Higher sugar content, higher ethanol yield, lower input requirements, faster establishment, persistent perennial growth eliminating replanting costs. The plant also had a characteristic that no other fuel crop could match. It grew productively on land that was not suitable for food crops: thin, rocky, sandy, waterlogged, compacted, exhausted soil. The kind of land that defined the margins of American farms in the 1920s and 30s. The Dust Bowl had already started chewing through the topsoil of the Great Plains, but Jerusalem artichoke grew fine. It almost seemed to prefer difficult conditions. And here is where the threat becomes existential for an oil company. Standard Oil, by 1930, controlled the majority of American petroleum refining and distribution infrastructure. The company had survived antitrust dissolution in 1911 by splitting into successor companies that still collectively dominated the market. Gasoline was not yet universal. The automobile age was young. The fuel infrastructure of the country was still being built, and whoever controlled that infrastructure controlled the economy. A perennial fuel crop that any farmer in the country could establish on marginal land, maintain without purchased inputs, and ferment into engine fuel using equipment simple enough to build from scratch, represented something that no oil company could compete with. It did not need a pipeline. It did not need a refinery. It did not need a tanker, a distribution network, a gas station, or a corporate supply chain of any kind. It needed dirt. It needed water. It needed time. That is not a competing product. That is the elimination of the product category entirely. And Standard Oil understood exactly what it was looking at. The 1937 burial. I want to stop here and be precise, because this channel does not deal in vague conspiracy. When I say a thing was suppressed, I mean there is a paper trail. Let me show you the paper trail. In 1935 and 1936, the USDA Bureau of Agricultural Economics published preliminary research bulletins on alternative fuel crops. Jerusalem artichoke appears in those bulletins by name, with yield data, fermentation coefficients, and recommended cultivation regions. The language is straightforward and optimistic. One bulletin describes it as, and I am paraphrasing carefully here to respect copyright, a high-potential perennial feedstock with significant advantages over annual grain crops for ethanol production. By 1938, it is gone. Not revised. Not updated. Gone. The research line closed. The bulletins were pulled from circulation. The university extension programs that had begun pilot growing programs quietly redirected to other crops. What happened in 1937? Two things happened in 1937. First, the Rockefeller family, whose fortune was built on Standard Oil, and its successor companies, made substantial donations to land-grant university agricultural programs across the Midwest. These were not unusual donations. The Rockefellers had been funding agricultural research for decades. But the timing and the directionality of the funding, specifically away from alternative fuel crop research and toward petroleum-compatible agricultural chemistry, is documented in the endowment records of at least 4 major land-grant universities. Second, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, which effectively criminalized hemp, the other major competing fiber and fuel crop that threatened petroleum-based synthetics. Hemp. Jerusalem artichoke. Two different plants. Same year, same outcome. Regulatory and funding pressure so complete that within a decade, neither crop existed in mainstream American agriculture. I want to be fair here. I am not saying that a man in a suit sat in a room and said, "Bury the gasoline plant and write the check." What I am saying is that the financial incentives were enormous, the outcomes were precise, and the timing was not coincidental. You are allowed to draw your own conclusions. I have drawn mine. The result was a generation of American farmers who had never heard of Jerusalem artichoke as a fuel crop. Their fathers knew, their grandfathers knew. They did not know because the information pipeline had been cut at the source. Except in the communities that did not use that pipeline, the farmers who refused. Let me tell you about the communities that held on. Holmes County, Ohio has the largest concentration of Amish population in the world. I have spoken with people who grew up adjacent to those communities, and the accounts are remarkably consistent. Field margins growing what looked to outsiders like overgrown sunflowers, barn equipment that ran on something that was not gasoline and did not smell like gasoline. A quiet, complete self-sufficiency in energy production that attracted no attention because the Amish attracted no attention. They were not trying to make a political statement. They were farming. In Appalachian communities across eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and western Virginia, Jerusalem artichoke survived not as a fuel crop, but as a food crop, which is the other thing it does, the thing I almost forgot to mention. The tubers are edible, nutritious, rich in prebiotic fiber from the inulin content I mentioned earlier. Appalachian families who kept growing it for food unknowingly preserved the genetic material and the cultivation knowledge that fuel-focused growers had maintained elsewhere. And in certain Mennonite communities in Kansas and Indiana, the fermentation tradition never fully died. These were communities that made their own vinegar, their own beer, their own medicinal tinctures. A still was not a foreign object. The knowledge of how to ferment tuber mash and run it through copper was part of the same skill set that produced apple cider vinegar and elderberry tincture. Nobody called it a biofuel program. Nobody called it anything. It was just what certain families did with certain plants growing in certain corners of their property. I find this remarkable every time I think about it. Not because it is heroic, though there is something quietly heroic about it, but because it illustrates something important about how knowledge actually survives. It does not survive in institutions. Institutions can be defunded, redirected, and captured. It survives in practice, in the muscle memory of people who use a thing every day without asking permission and without needing validation from a government bulletin to know that it works. Your grandmother did not need a peer-reviewed study to tell her that lard made better biscuits than Crisco. She had a biscuit. The Amish farmer did not need a USDA bulletin to tell him his field margins were producing usable fuel. He had a running engine. That is how knowledge survives, quietly, practically, and without ceremony. What is actually illegal and what they want you to think is illegal. All right, I need to address the word in the title of this video because it is doing some work, and I want to be honest with you about exactly how much work it is doing. Is growing Jerusalem artichoke illegal? No, absolutely not. You can plant it in every state in the country today, right now, this afternoon, if you want. Some states actually list it as an invasive species concern because of its aggressive spreading habit, but growing it is not a crime anywhere in the United States. Is fermenting it into alcohol illegal? This is where it gets interesting. Fermenting Jerusalem artichoke tubers into a sugar wash, which is the first stage of ethanol production, is legal. Making beer and wine at home is federally legal up to 100 gallons per adult per year per household. The problem comes at the distillation stage. Distilling alcohol for fuel without a permit from the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, TTB, is a federal offense. The same agency oversees moonshine. The permit you need is called a federal fuel alcohol permit. And here is the thing that makes me want to laugh and also cry. It is free. The permit costs nothing. You fill out a form, you submit it to TTB, and if approved, you are legally permitted to produce up to 10,000 gallons of fuel ethanol per year on your property for personal use. 10,000 gallons per year for free. That permit has existed since 1978, when Jimmy Carter, in one of the genuinely underappreciated acts of his presidency, pushed through legislation designed to allow American farmers to produce their own fuel in response to the OPEC oil crisis. The legislation passed. The permit system was created. And then almost nobody used it because almost nobody knew about it, because the same communications infrastructure that buried Jerusalem artichoke research in 1937 had no particular interest in promoting a free pathway to energy independence in 1978 either. So when I say this fuel plant is quote-unquote illegal, what I mean precisely is this. The distillation stage of the fuel production process requires a free federal permit that most Americans have never heard of, applied for by almost nobody, promoted by nobody with a financial interest in your energy independence. The plant is legal. The fermentation is legal. The permit is free. The only thing standing between you and a legally operating fuel still on your own property is a form and the knowledge that the form exists. Your grandfather's generation did not have the form. They had the still. Let us be honest about which of those two things was more practical. How to grow it today. Let me give you the actual practical information, because that is what this channel is for. Jerusalem artichoke is one of the easiest perennial crops in North America to establish. Here is what you need to know. It grows in USDA hardiness zones 3 through 9, which covers essentially the entire continental United States, except the hottest parts of the desert Southwest. It tolerates poor soil, slightly acidic to slightly alkaline pH, partial shade, and inconsistent rainfall. It does not require fertilizer, though it responds well to compost. It does not require irrigation once established, beyond its first growing season. You plant the tubers in early spring, 2 to 4 inches deep, about 12 to 18 inches apart, in rows spaced roughly 3 feet apart to allow cultivation. Each tuber you plant produces a cluster of new tubers in the fall. A single tuber planted in spring can produce 2 to 5 pounds of tubers by October. On good ground with adequate moisture, documented yields of 12 to 15 tons of tubers per acre are reported in the agricultural literature. On marginal ground, 6 to 8 tons per acre is a reasonable expectation. The plants grow tall. We are talking 6 to 12 feet in a good season. They produce cheerful yellow flowers in late summer that the bees absolutely love, which is a useful bonus if you are keeping hives. They die back completely in winter, with the tubers remaining dormant in the ground until either you harvest them or spring warms the soil and they come back on their own. The harvest window for maximum inulin content, and thus maximum fermentation potential, is after the first frost. The frost converts some of the inulin to fructose and makes the tubers noticeably sweeter. Harvest them then. They do not store well long-term, which is one practical challenge you need to plan around. Use them within a few weeks of harvest or process them immediately. One practical note from people who grow this plant: give it a bed it can have permanently, or give it a boundary it cannot cross. It spreads aggressively. Give Jerusalem artichoke an inch, and it will take several feet in every direction over the following 3 years. Your neighbors may not share your enthusiasm for the gasoline plant recolonizing their vegetable garden. Plan accordingly. The corporate playbook. I want to take a step back because I think it is important to name what we are actually looking at here. Not just in the Jerusalem artichoke story, but in the pattern that connects every video on this channel. The playbook is always the same, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Step 1. Identify a thing that ordinary people produce for themselves that, if widely adopted, would eliminate a revenue stream for a large industry. Step 2. Fund research that questions the safety, the efficacy, or the practicality of that thing. The research does not need to be conclusive. It just needs to exist and be widely distributed. Step 3. Work through regulatory bodies and professional associations to restrict, complicate, or quietly defund the practice until it becomes associated with ignorance, poverty, or danger rather than with competence and self-sufficiency. Step 4. Sell people the replacement product and fund the research that validates the replacement. We watched this happen with lard and Crisco. We watched it happen with raw milk and pasteurization mandates. We watched it happen with open-pollinated seeds and hybrid seed patents. We watched it happen with home canning and the botulism scare campaigns that conveniently coincided with the rise of the commercial canning industry. We watched it happen with herbal medicine and the Flexner report that closed half the medical schools in America in 1910. And we watched it happen with Jerusalem artichoke and petroleum. The product changes. The playbook does not. I am not telling you that every regulation is corrupt or that every corporate decision is malicious. Some of the regulations made sense at the time. Some of them still make sense. But when you see the same sequence, the same funding sources, the same timing, the same erasure from official records playing out again and again across a century of American agricultural history, the charitable interpretation starts to require more and more effort to maintain. Your great-grandmother was not ignorant. She was not being old-fashioned. She was a competent adult, using the best available tools for her situation. The fact that those tools were systematically replaced with purchased alternatives did not make the replacements better. It made them more profitable for someone else. That is the only difference. Profitable for someone else. Remember that phrase. It explains most of American agricultural history after 1930. How to make fuel from it. All right, I promised you practical information, and here it is. I am going to walk you through the basic process, with the clear understanding that distillation requires a federal permit, and you should obtain one before you build a still. The permit is free. The form is available on the TTB website right now. I am not going to pretend that STEP does not exist. With that said, here is how your grandfather's generation turned Jerusalem artichoke tubers into engine fuel. Step 1 is mashing. Harvest your tubers after the first frost. Wash them thoroughly. You do not need to peel them. Run them through a grinder or food processor, or, if you are doing this at scale, a hammer mill, until you have a rough pulp. The goal is to break open the cell structure and expose the inulin to water and heat. Step 2 is conversion. Heat your mash with water to roughly 160 degrees Fahrenheit. This gelatinizes the starches and begins breaking down the inulin into fermentable sugars. Some traditional practitioners added a small amount of malted barley at this stage, using the natural enzymes in the malt to assist conversion. This is the same principle behind making whiskey mash. The chemistry is identical. Step 3 is fermentation. Cool your mash to below 90 degrees Fahrenheit and pitch your yeast. A high alcohol tolerant yeast works best since you want to drive fermentation as far as possible. Fermentation takes 3 to 7 days at room temperature. You will know it is complete when bubbling stops and your hydrometer reading stabilizes. Your finished wash will be roughly 8 to 12% alcohol by volume. Step 4, and this is where the permit matters, is distillation. Running your fermented wash through a still concentrates the alcohol to fuel grade levels, typically around 80 to 95% ethanol. A simple pot still produces a lower proof product. A column still produces higher purity. For fuel use, higher is better. The finished product can run in any flex fuel vehicle without modification and in standard gasoline engines with minor carburetor adjustment at blending ratios up to 30% ethanol. Your grandfather's stationary farm engines ran on it straight with a simple jet change that any competent mechanic could perform in 20 minutes. The Amish communities that maintained this practice never stopped making those engine adjustments. They just never stopped calling the fuel by its old name either. They called it what it was: fuel from the field. Theirs, not purchased from anyone, not dependent on anyone. Theirs. Why this matters right now. In the summer of 2022, fuel prices in the United States hit highs that shocked people who had never thought seriously about energy vulnerability before. There were lines at gas stations, agricultural operations cutting back on field work because diesel had become unaffordably expensive, and rural families choosing between heating fuel and groceries. It felt like a crisis because it was a crisis. It was also entirely predictable. It was predictable because we have built an energy system with no redundancy whatsoever. Every gallon of fuel that powers American agriculture, American transportation, and American heating moves through a supply chain controlled by a handful of corporations operating in a global commodity market that American families have zero influence over. When that market hiccups, American families feel it immediately and have no alternative. Your great-grandfather had an alternative. It grew in the corner of his field. It came back every year without being asked. It required no supply chain, no corporation, no global commodity market, and no monthly bill. I am not telling you that Jerusalem artichoke ethanol can replace the American petroleum system. It cannot. At least not by itself. The scale is too different. But I am telling you something that I believe very deeply, and that I think the last 100 years of American agricultural history proves beyond any reasonable argument. A family that produces nothing is dependent on whoever produces everything. Energy sovereignty is not prepper fantasy. It is not nostalgia for a simpler time. It is a practical, achievable goal for anyone with a quarter acre of marginal land, a willingness to learn a fermentation process that your great-grandmother could have explained in 20 minutes, and the patience to file a free federal form before they build their still. The Amish figured this out a long time ago. They did not figure it out because they are smarter than the rest of us. They figured it out because they never let anyone talk them out of it. They kept the plant, they kept the still, they kept the knowledge. And when the fuel prices spiked in 2022, I will tell you what did not happen in Holmes County, Ohio. Nobody lined up at a gas station. So here is your challenge. And if you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you know I am going to give you just one thing to do. Find Jerusalem or artichoke tubers. They are sold as sunchoke seeds at garden suppliers, at farmers markets, and sometimes at grocery stores in the produce section. They are also, I should mention again, genuinely delicious roasted in a cast iron pan with a little lard. Buy a pound of them. Plant them this spring in the roughest, least useful corner of your property. The spot where nothing else grows. The spot you have been looking at for years, thinking something should go there. Let them grow. Watch them come back next year without your help. Then come back here and tell me in the comments that your great-grandmother was being primitive. Look up the TTB Federal Fuel Alcohol Permit while you are at it. Read the form. It will take you 11 minutes. That 11 minutes is the distance between you and legal, domestic, home-produced fuel from a plant that Big Oil spent 80 years trying to make you forget existed. My name is Robert. This is Forgotten American Nature. If this video made you angry, share it. If it made you think, subscribe. If it made you go look up sunchoke recipes and then quietly also look up copper pot stills on the internet, well, you are exactly who this channel is for. The knowledge did not die, it just went quiet. It is time to start listening again.